days dark and stormy, while great Lenin led us, our eyes saw the bright sun of freedom above, and Stalin, our leader, with faith in the people, inspired us to build the land that we love.
Howdy, y'all. Welcome back. I don't have a lot of time to record this week, so we'll get back into more current events and fun shit next week. But I wanted to try something different. It's no different than the actual format. And just do more of a loose rant this week and today. Kind of inspired by the Kush vlog. aka Grill Pill, videos that Matt Christman puts out. My goal is, of course, to produce hour-long content. We will see if I make it for a fucking hour or not. I'm getting closer, though, I think. I think I'm getting to where I'm able to go longer. So one thing that I wanted to talk about was the idea that, before we have a real people's revolution, a proletarian revolution, of course, this has to be predated and also in large part predicated by a lesser or perhaps more open, more seen earlier bourgeois revolution. And a good example of this is in American feminism, right? Turn of the 20th century, rich white women flood the streets of major cities. They destroy things. They burn cars. They fuck shit up. And they say, hey, we want the right to vote. They don't want the right to vote for poor white women, nor black women, nor poor black women, nor anyone except they themselves. They want the urban elite women whose husbands can vote to also be able to vote. That's literally their only goal. And in large part, I suppose, they succeeded, right? They created, the missives, right? They said, oh, well, look at here. We deserve the right to vote so we can protect ourselves from violence and sexual violence and harassment, sexual harassment. But in doing so, right, we see the first folly of essentially of bourgeois activism. You see, the issue is the fundamental change between what makes an activist movement or action bourgeois and proletarian is the same fundamental change that we have to assess when we're looking at what makes something necessary and unnecessary, what makes something useful and superfluous. The bourgeois action can be noticed first by where it functions and not what it is or why it functions. Where it functions in the bourgeois sense, or in the sense that I'm referring to here, is what political space, what space in society does it occupy? Because what we're seeing right now, of course, and what we've seen before, of course, in bourgeois activism, is that we see them work within the pre-existing systems and structures. They say, oh, at the very least, they say, the systems that we currently have had good intentions and have been corrupted. Oh, we live in a world that was ultimately designed to be equal. Clearly, we could see this in things like the American Constitution, right? We can read this piece of paper and it says all men are created equal. Ergo, everything else in this document, clearly, according to the bourgeois, will support the idea that all men are created equal. Following from that, from the concept that we are all equal, surely it must follow and come from that women are also equal. Or at least the same men that can vote, their women, are equal to them. And so the liberal, the bourgeois liberal at least, will work within the system because ultimately they do not see, they do not understand that a system that has created the justice that they need to exist could be natively bad. They can only see a corrupting influence. This even affects, right? Because, of course, we know that class supersedes all else. Class supersedes race, class supersedes sex, class supersedes sexuality, class supersedes gender. But the liberal does not. The liberal does not even recognize that class is a function except as a visual cue, right? The liberal only sees class when in the clothes that you buy, in the house that you own, in the car that you drive. This is where the liberal identifies your wealth as a class, as opposed to your societal station and function as relates to your relationship to capital. This is how the liberal sees it, of course. So for them, right, they cannot fathom, the liberal truly cannot fathom, that the just society that they live in is only just in so long as you are a member of a ruling class or are following the missives of the ruling class. Because the liberal does not recognize psychic violence, right? Now, I know I sound like Marianne Williamson here, but when we're looking at how the society structures a people, how it moves a people, how it garners its own power, it does so, right, through violence. Of course, all states are predicated on violence. However, while all states are predicated on and created by and sustained by violence, there are two forms of this violence, at least two, arguably more. Probably, I will try and go into two. There's the oblique physical violence that we see in lower tier capitalist states, right? And so what I'm saying here is there exists an index, the HDI, the Human Development Index. And on this index, we kind of have a few different tiers, right? Fuck. Yeah. All right. So we've got tiers. And largely these tiers are, you go from a tier 0, a hunter-gatherer society, to a tier 1, a pre-industrial, a tier 2, an industrial, a tier 3, an industrializing, a tier 4, say post-industrial, and then a theoretical tier 5. This is how capitalist society is structured, at least. And it essentially posits that, right, the liberal mind posits that they are currently the most advanced society, the most advanced people, the most advanced group to ever exist. They don't recognize their material conditions, nor the material conditions of those before them. The liberal only sees, more or less, that these structures exist to create a system in which there is peace in where they live, and perhaps there's violence somewhere else. But they are okay. And that the violence somewhere else is either justified or not, based on whether or not those people there are as advanced as the liberals are here. And so the physical violence, right, that supersedes and creates the state is essentially, it is policing, yes, but it's more so, it's terrorism, physical terrorism. It's also, how surveilled you are, how tracked, how notably tracked, right? How much you are aware of that surveillance, right, makes a difference. And it's also how clearly the apartheid takes place, if there is an apartheid. So like in America, there's a clear apartheid state, right? Black people don't have the same rights as white people. People of color don't have the same rights as people that pass. And generally speaking, you will never, until you reach the true bourgeois class, unless you are a breakout, then you'll never change your economic station unless you compromise your class values. Right? That's how the American state functions. And this, right, is because America uses psychic violence as opposed to physical violence largely to enforce things. Why would the state waste its time gathering the detriment of society, the lumpenproll, together and killing them, when it could just instead just plant the thought in your minds? Because the state can teach you how to think. The state doesn't have to tell you what to think, because the state can teach you how to think and know how you think and then play with that. There's no reason for the state to tell you what to think. That's of the past now. And so what we see is our states today, they don't have to worry about telling you anything. They can just say, let's talk about the lumpenproll. They can just tell you subliminally. They can just make it a cultural fact that the homeless don't work. That the homeless, the people without houses, the dehoused, are dirty, that they are sick, that they are broken people, that they have no use, right? Because if they had a use, clearly to the liberal has a use, and the liberal gets to do that function for society and gets to be rewarded clearly for doing that in a way that clearly the homeless man is not to the liberal. And so the only way that the liberal can comprehend the existence of homelessness, the existence of disease, the existence of the ultimate disease of poverty and capital, is to say he is not doing something which he should be doing. This is psychic violence. Because how can the lumpenproll ever come up beyond the station assigned to him by this psychic state? He can't. Because the entirety of the society will be designed ultimately at his detriment. Similarly speaking, I'm going to drink some coffee. Similarly speaking, we have to look at the way that the liberal democracy allows entry points into it. Now, I'm not going to say, in China, democracy is not merely putting slips of paper in a box. That's dungus. That's bullshit. But what I am going to say is, right, when we're looking at how a state is structured, perhaps one of the most powerful indicators of where change lies within it, if at all, is in how the electoral process functions. Currently, the United States is governed by a dictatorship of 9 very old people who have appointments for life that the people cannot change or control. And these people are appointed by a supreme citizen, essentially, who was born in America, who is old, and who can afford, either through political or physical capital, to run a campaign in which they do not have access to any of the higher functions of the state except for its money, possibly. As they pursue votes from a college of unnamed, unknown individuals called the Electoral College, who have free licensure in the majority of states to choose the president, the supreme citizen, based on whatever the fuck they please. If they go in there and they decide they're voting Mickey Mouse today, that's who the fuck they're voting for. In addition, in the United States, there exists another body of the government, which is the legislative branch, ostensibly, which exists of a quote-unquote congressional level, which is highly popularized, which goes to a review organ similar to the House of Lords, which is made up by longer timed appointees on a much larger scale, of which there are 100, and which are not in any way representative of the population. Ties are broken by essentially the supreme citizen. And so the liberal democracy that exists in America says that the barrier for entry is either political or physical capital. The only way that you can gain power within the pre-existing systems that are in America, that make up the American democracy, are to have pre-existing capital or have a means of amassing large new capital. The latter of which is gatekept by two political parties who exist not to oppose one another, but to oppose the proletarian by keeping him, her, them invested more in the false struggle between the parties than in the struggle of their everyday life. The modern American has access to, on average, fewer and less healthful calories than the citizen of the USSR did in 1980. Which, at that time, the USSR largely couldn't even be considered socialist. Social imperialist, different. And so we see here, right, one of these contradictions of capital. We see the idea that the people of a society, the liberals, typically rule more or less the society. They are the highest functioning level of rulership by the people. And so what they do and how they choose to do it is largely left up to them and is ultimately a function of a higher ruling class. Because who has educated the liberal, who employs the liberal, who gives the liberal access to everything he has? It is the political ruling class, it is the capitalist ruling class, but it is also the class which can, in a very incestuous way, pick and choose its own successors. What do I mean by that? I mean that you cannot change the functions within the current American governance without interacting with one of the two main parties who only work within themselves and who, even at a quote-unquote lower, quote-unquote devolved level, have full licensure to pick and choose people to be representatives to their own populations. What this means is that on a federal level, right, at the level of the country, the ruling class here has full say-so over the ruling class that is below them at the state level, that is ostensibly there to amass power and to change who is at the top. Meaning that, in an oligarchical way, the power structures revolve around the two key parties who are themselves friends with one another. Meaning that what we're seeing is, in large part, the idea that you cannot change the society from within without interacting with one of the pre-existing organizations and organs with which power is handled and with which things are changed. And because you must interact with them, you must come from the neoliberal stance. I don't like social democrats. I think they're idiots. This is why. Because you will never manage, ever. No society has ever managed. No one has ever, in the history of humanity, made an electoral movement and through electoral means alone progressed into the next stage of human society, which is socialism. Because when you interact with that neoliberal organ, of which both parties are the same and do the same functions, you have to abandon your lesser power structures and join with their greater ones, or else you will yourself become the victim of the psychic violence. What does that mean? What do I mean by that? How do you feel about the word socialism? Now, how do you feel about the word Marxism? Marxism-Leninism, Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, Bolshevik-Leninism, Stalinism. All of these preconceived notions which we have are the result of generations and centuries of psychic and physical violence. Often, in fact, the physical violence is used as a justification of the psychic violence, such as in the case of the American terrorist state, right? Here in America, the greatest fear, the fear above all fears, the fear above the radical Negro burning down the cracker's house, is that the radical Negro be a Muslim. That is the highest level of fear and terror in America. Comes from the idea that an outsider, someone who is of another religion, someone who is from the Middle East or the Levant, will come here and blow something up. And so to quote unquote prevent that from happening, this rare occasion, there has to be a high level, a high organ of psychic violence within the state that exists to ensure that no citizens, right? Because the citizenry is the new white man, except in the case of the white man in America. Because the apartheid state looks like it is divided most utterly racially, when in reality the apartheid state that exists in this country is ultimately governed along class lines, just as most others. Because all society, except communist society, will have class. And so as we're looking here and as we're understanding here, this fear of that other, right, is the ultimate prevailing notion within liberal thought. This is what marks a neoliberal, is that he sees, right, when the neoliberal looks at the world, he sees a we and a them. He sees a citizen and an other. He sees a home front and an invasion force. And he sees ultimately that these are governed by, because he does not see class, he does not understand class in any meaningful way, he assumes that these are all governed by another. He sees ultimately race lines, he sees ultimately religious lines, he sees ultimately just a lot of sex lines, he sees sexism, he sees everything except the class line, which ultimately divides humanity. And why does he see these things? He sees them because it is his understanding of the world and of the state of the world that man has evolved past class. As far as the liberal is aware, the structures which bring him justice and peace also bring a level of movement to others. And so he justifies the psychic violence that is experienced not only by others, but also by himself. He himself is a victim of this psychic violence. And so he sees it as highly justified because it is, to him, preventing a higher level of physical violence. Because the liberal tiers these violences. I will assure you that there is no difference in your life between this physical and this psychic violence, except that, I suppose, in the one you lose your leg, and in the other you are depressed, you have an eating disorder because you can't control the world around you, you have Anxiety because you have the dizziness of freedom, as Kierkegaard put it. You have this dizziness that is caused by the illusion of freedom. You get to see what you could do if only you had the means, or perhaps the will, which has also been drained from you by the psychic violence. You get to understand that while you are in a favela, on the other side of a wall, here we have this massive this mander, right? And so, down to the very way in which you are taught, in which the very way you learn to think and conceptualize, in the liberal, just society, the psychic violence is taking place because you see yourself as ultimately lesser. There's only the we and there's the other, and often for the liberal, the we is actually weaker than the other. And so it becomes an underdog narrative. And of course they want the underdog to win. And so from a philosophical lens, what we're seeing here and what we need to understand about revolutions is that when we have these crises within ourselves, we are, as humans, but a reflection of our material conditions. Yes, we possess free will. I would say. I'm actually quite religious. I have weird takes on these things. Feel free to skip like 5 minutes. Yes, we possess free will, but we possess free will in that our material conditions define and bind us, and yet we can also affect that environment. Man, at every stage of his development, should have the capability to fully and radically change the station in which he exists, the place in which he exists, and the way in which he exists. The only thing which holds man back from this is capital, and is his station in relation to capital. Because what we have to understand is, within the neoliberal context, the only people who can affect change into the world are the rich and are the bourgeois. And why is this? This is because to make things happen, frankly, in capitalism, you have to possess one of two kinds of essentially power, which are either political capital or physical capital. Looking back at the example of women from earlier, women in America, bourgeois women, took back a lesser form of capital, sexual capital, for themselves. Only for the bourgeois, let us be sure. Still, the city itself is designed against them. Still, the society itself is designed against them. But at their class level, they did not yet realize the power that they held. So they took back what is considered sexual capital. It became illegal to rape them. It became illegal to force them to do things they did not want to do. It became immoral to thrust oneself upon them in a way they did not approve of or solicit. That was the change. For bourgeois women, it became illegal. Now, if you go to prison, become a lumpen, it's totally legal. It's fine. It's encouraged even that the officer in that prison become your pimp while you are there, because that doesn't affect the bourgeois woman, does it? No, it affects the lumpen. It affects essentially the other. It affects the class of people within the society that are citizens, but that are so weak as citizens that to the liberal, they are holding back the liberal. They are holding back the whole of the citizenry, right? These poor, these lumpen, are holding back all the people above them who just, if they would just fucking die, if the lumpen would just die, just stop fucking bothering to breathe, to live, to struggle, to exist, then no longer would these problems exist within the liberal society, because they would have solved them. And in having solved them, they wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. And so the society could think about bigger things in advance. But it cannot solve these fundamental crises of capital. And it all comes back to, ultimately, capital. Because what you have to understand is, I am but a very odd gay religious tanky. I don't have an ideology that I would say. I wouldn't say I have an ideology, right? I wouldn't say I'm an ideologue. I would say I follow the ultimate science of Marxism that says that things will occur in a certain order. And the only changes we as humans are going to make on that order is how long it takes to fucking get there. Because regardless, right? Once society gets bad enough, there's going to be a goddamn revolution. And we're going to move to a more social state. The question is only whether that revolution will then predicate a much larger later revolution as a simple feedback loop, because the society is ultimately still too capitalist, or if it will advance into a socialist state. I'm just trying to help advance history more rapidly. There's going to be the revolution regardless. It might not be today, it might not be tomorrow. I might not live to see it. But it'll fucking come. It'll happen. Who knows when? And so what we have to understand is the liberal doesn't see that. The liberal sees himself as a reflection of the highest level of society ever. And I say reflection because the liberal cannot effectate change within his own life. Only the bourgeois capitalist class can do that. And the reason only the bourgeois capitalist class can effect change within his own life and is free of all these mental disorders and dysfunctions and maladies is because only the capitalist class can go out and change the way in which he lives. Elon Musk can wake up tomorrow, and has done, and just throw all of his shit out. He said, no, I'm done owning shit myself. Transfers the property of his property, the titles on the shit over to his woman, and then everything else that he can, all his books and shit, he just sells, throws out, because he didn't want them. He wanted to have that moment of urge and control predicated by nothing. All humans want this. This is what makes us fucking thinking beings, right? You are a thinking being because you look at your environment and you decide that you want it in a different way, and you effectate that change onto it. You cannot do this as an imitation. The liberal will do this as an imitation and think that this is solving their problems, and it will just give them licensure to ignore these further, deeper problems. What that looks like, right? We have this dumb as shit show on Netflix. It's got like Mary something or other, and she cleans her fucking her flat. She's like, oh, take the things in your house and sort them. Do they bring joy or not? If they don't bring joy, you don't need them. But this is the same as Elon Musk, and yet it is a hollow husk in reflection. Because when the liberal sees this on the television, he concedes within his own mind. He says immediately, he throws out all of his own capital. He says, I'm going to go through my own home and do what she just showed me how to do. I'm just going to repeat and monkey what I have just seen on this television screen. I will throw out the things that just simply do not bring me joy. And so as he's doing so, he's not actually changing the state of his life. He still works at a fucking call center. He's still a middle manager for a large corporate entity that's actually based in the EU. He's still nobody. Nothing has changed. He's still married to the same ugly woman. He still has the same bratty kids, still drives the same shitty car down the road to go work for 40 fucking hours at a job that takes 15. But for that brief moment, he held in his hands the only levers of power that have ever been accessible to him, which are the things which he owns physically, which are capital, or reflections thereof. And so herein lies the dangerous issue of liberal media and of the psychic violence which we exist within. Because the psychic violence will sap away from you your true free will and your true desire and replace it with a lack of affectation in your life, which will lead to a lack of representation of yourself within your own life, which will lead to a lack of control, which will lead to fundamentally issues with the world that you cannot reconcile, because they do not come from crises of the self, but from crises of capital. The internet atheist is an interesting class of person. They are hyper-rationalists, and they would look at what I just said and say that the religious think the same, that the religious people do the same. And the issue is, there is a level of hyper-rationalization at which you more or less become the god of your own existence in a preternatural, unrealistic way. And what I mean by that is, human thought, right, within the context of capital that we live under, can only take you so far as the society allows it to go. And in fact, by obsessing over something like religion and something like your state within it, you will miss out on the larger picture of the levers of control, because instead of focusing in on what was causing problems and what was shaping the world, you have focused in on, as I keep saying, a reflection of these things. The rationalist says, oh, look, these silly religious are trying to understand questions that don't exist. They're saying, oh, well, look, they're too lazy, they're too dumb, they're not intelligent enough, they're not evolved enough, they're not the we. And if they are the we, they're holding us back from combating the greater other, which is ignorance, according to the rationalist. When in reality, right, the issues that each group is considering are very highly different. Many of the most competent people I know in their fields are rather quite religious. Now, one class of people, the moderate, would say that this is probably because they are trying to understand why in society they are more gifted than others. And I promise this will all come back to class. As you may have noticed, the way I speak and the way I rant is essentially that I make concentric circles of arguments and of thoughts that ultimately all revolve around and all concede on the same things, but are different examples so that you can understand it from different angles and see it in different places in your life. And so the moderate rationalist says these things. But on the flip side, on the perhaps more crucial side to see, the religious is not faithful because it is easy or because it means that they don't have to think about things. They are faithful because it is a separate lens from capital. One of the few areas of power that still largely exist is the area of intellectual power as it pertains beyond the state, right? So what does that mean? That means that when we reach out onto means of thought that don't exist more or less within the purview of the state. So, for example, theology, largely. Philosophy in some places. Outside of state schools, probably philosophy. Most of the social sciences, really, except economics, have a lot of free range outside of the system and outside of the levers of power. And I would consider theology a social science. Go fuck yourself. In the same way that I would consider Marxism a social science. And so what we're looking at, right, is we're looking at the fundamental ways in which the people consider their station in the world. Because the rationalist sees himself as the highest entity ever, whereas the religious sees the world as ultimately in a subservient state to man and God, or to the higher power, which is itself reflected in the material around man, which man can affectate. Meaning that, ultimately, the religious comes far closer to realizing the truth, that is, material affecting man, than the rationalist. Because the rationalist has become obsessed with his own ego, and has lost sight of the greater lens through which life is governed, which is material. You're not going to advance beyond your material state unless you have the means to edit that state, which psychic violence in the liberal state has stripped you of thinking you have, or has changed how you see that, and has changed how you think you have that power to change your reality, to shape it. And it has done so not by telling you to shut the fuck up, but by teaching you a different way of thinking than would lead you to come to these conclusions yourself. Because there is a simple power in telling you what to think. And that simple power is far superseded by and overshadowed by simply teaching you how to think about different things. Because it is one simple, easy task to tell you, go fuck yourself. But it is another thing entirely to teach you from your very core that you are always to follow the same simple systems, because these simple systems only exist as a organ of our society, which is ours, which is the highest reflection of society yet. Because the liberal, again, only knows himself as it relates to the powers that have created how he sees himself, but truly, he only sees himself as a competitor on the larger field, and as either a winner or a loser, typically an underdog. Because liberal society has more or less cucked itself, damn near out of existence. What do I mean by that? The obsession with competition within capitalism is one of the most bizarre, gaudy, bawdry, and simplistically minded things that I've ever seen or noticed in my life. It's perhaps the most aggravating thing that I can think of is this obsession with competition and the idea that the self is only reflected through competition. Because ultimately, if we follow this lens, if we follow this logic that the liberals sell us on with the idea of competition, then we would notice that no competition is fair under capitalism. What do I mean by that? Regardless of whether or not it's neoliberal capitalism, regardless of whether or not it's quote-unquote free market capital, which has never existed and never will, and would be a degeneration of society. the capitalist system presupposes that you have a pre-existing manner of wealth or power, capital, be that political or physical. And because you have that pre-existing capital, there is no way to extricate that capital from the game, from the competition, from the system in which you are arguing or debating or fighting or playing football or whatever the fuck, or racing or watching horses race. There is no way to remove those capitals from this system in which you are competing. And because of this, no competition can be a proper representation of everyone involved, because it relies on that pre-existing or outside capital. And if you don't have that pre-existing capital, you have to lever and levy yourself to go find that capital, just often to access the competition itself. Meaning that resultantly, the competition is only a reflection of capital and of the material, not of the self. Only under socialism, only under really communism, do you see the ability for a real, true, fair competition. Because only then could you compete as yourself, right? If every child is taught in the same way, fairly, with no exceptions and no way out, then, and only then, can we see the children compete as themselves. Because under capital, they are only ever a reflection of their parents, and ultimately of the parent state which created them. Because of course, under capital, even parenting exists as a violent means, right? As a means of violence, which removes control. Because the capitalist class doesn't see these changes, and it doesn't see these evolutions of the self as good unless they procure more capital. Because the capitalist system is paradoxically obsessed with itself, and more obsessed, in an equal sense, with the illusion of not being self-obsessed. Try to fucking figure out what the hell I just said. And so there is no such thing as success under capital, because you will only ever be a reflection of an earlier petit bourge, proletarian bourge notion of success. And I say this because capital will generally attract itself. So over time, as the capitalist society progresses, there becomes less and less capital at the fringes of society. It is driven inwards. And so lower generations of the fringes of society will actually have less to work with than earlier generations. And so their capital structures have degenerated and have actually transferred all of their wealth and stolen it from them and sent it up the ladder. Eventually, the massive American petty bourgeois class will begin to degenerate at such an unsupportable rate that will mark the beginning of the class war in America. Because any earlier struggles, while they might aid the proletarian, will ultimately be stolen from him, not even by the bourgeois class, but by the petty bourgeois manager class, because in their infantile state, the petty bourgeois have no reason not to steal any capital from the lower classes, because ultimately all that capital will naturally be given up to them. There is no escape. There is no beating it. You do not win in capitalism. There's only loss to varying degrees. And this is the nature of the bourgeois revolution, which becomes the proletarian revolution under capital.